University on the other America, and we'll bring it home here and begin to talk about that in the context of where Detroit finds itself. Take a listen to Martin Luther King Jr. at Stanford University.
Today I would like to talk mainly about the race problem, since I'll have to rush right out and go to New York to talk about Vietnam tomorrow, and I've been talking about it a great deal this week and weeks before that. But I'd like to use as a subject from which to speak this afternoon the other America. And I use this subject because there are literally two Americas. One America is beautiful for situation. And in a sense, this America is overflowing with the milk of prosperity and the honey of opportunity. This America is the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, and culture and education for their minds, and freedom and human dignity for their spirits. In this America, millions of people experience every day the opportunity of having life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in all of their dimensions. And in this America, millions of young people grow up in the sunlight of opportunity. But tragically and unfortunately, there is another America. This other America has a daily ugliness about it that constantly transforms the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair. In this America, millions of work-starved men walk the streets daily in search for jobs that do not exist. In this America, millions of people find themselves living in rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. In this America, people are poor by the millions, and they find themselves perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. In a sense, the greatest tragedy of this other America is what it does to little children. Little children in this other America are forced to grow up with clouds of inferiority forming every day in their little mental skies. And as we look at this other America, we see it as an arena of blasted hopes and shattered dreams. Many people of various backgrounds live in this other America. Some are Mexican Americans, some are Puerto Ricans, some are Indians, some happen to be from other groups. Millions of them are Appalachian whites. Probably the largest group in this other America, in proportion to its size in the population, is the American Negro. The American Negro finds himself living in a triple ghetto: a ghetto of race, a ghetto of poverty, a ghetto. Is to deal with this problem of the two Americas. We are seeking to make America one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Martin Luther King Jr., we're seeking to make America one nation, indivisible, with justice and liberty for all. We can say we're seeking to make Detroit one city, indivisible, with justice and liberty for all. Bill, the way Dr. King juxtaposes the America that is rich, lots of opportunity, milk and honey flowing in the streets, and then there's an America where you have the ghettos of race and poverty and so forth. And, he talked about the Hispanic community as well, oppressed communities, we call them, right? But he said the largest of this is the American Negro, that is black people in the United States and in terms of what they're going through. Looking at Detroit, it's not an exception to that other America. Detroit, in fact, defines that other America.
It's true that Detroit does define that other America, as do many other large cities. In fact, there are other areas of the country, even rural areas, where we see that dividing line. But African Americans have been the biggest group that have been on the other side of that dividing line for almost 400 years.
And when you look at the city of Detroit, we also want to take note for history's sake and for those who are observers of history and those who I think perhaps need to know as well. Dr. King gave the first draft of the I Have a Dream speech here in Detroit. Detroit has been an epicenter of the civil rights battle. And we're looking at Dr. King's speech at Stanford University, where he talked about the other America where there are no opportunities, the other America where kids, and what is interesting, Bill, is that he talked about kids who are growing up poor, kids who are growing up with their future held hostage, kids who are growing up with basically no future. And we're in Detroit. We talk about the number of kids that live in this city in abject poverty. And, as we're listening to the speech, I'm thinking about those families who were evicted last year, poor families evicted out of their homes. In fact, their homes are not even livable.
Well, it's one of those things where when we look at it, we can see it tremendously in Detroit. We can see the poverty. We can see the third thing that he mentioned was the ghetto of misery. And you couldn't hear that in the speech. These people live in a ghetto of race where they are defined by their skin color. They live in a ghetto of poverty. And finally, they live in a ghetto of misery. And when we look at our educational system, it does very little today to actually conquer those three ghettos, in part because it's gone through this cycle of roughly every 3 years realigning and redefining what education is for children in Detroit.
Right.
So roughly we lose a generation almost every 3 years because of that. Now, when you look at Dr. King's speech in 1967, we must also keep in mind that he gave that speech again, or a slightly different version of that speech in March of 1968, shortly before he was assassinated, and he gave it in Grosse Pointe. So Detroit has been the epicenter of the civil rights movement, and two of Dr. King's most famous speeches, this one and the I Have a Dream speech, were both given in the Detroit area.
Right. We've come to cash a check that has marked insufficient funds. We're talking about Dr. King's speech, The Other America, that was delivered at Stanford University in 1967. Attorney Bill Noakes is my guest. Yeah, we're having this conversation ahead of the MLK Day on Monday because what would MLK tell us if you have an idea? 313-778-7600, 313-778-7600. You can also comment on social media as well. We're live on Facebook. If Dr. King were alive today, how would he describe Detroit? Would he say Detroit is a city that is coming back from the brink of decadence? Would Dr. King be singing the Kumbaya song that comes with this idea of a city that is on top of a hill coming back, the best thing happening, the best story being written in the Midwest, right? I mean, what would Dr. King say about the political leaders of the city?
Well, my supposition is this. Dr. King was a Baptist minister, and thus he saw in people the ability to change their hearts. But he was also a realistic pragmatist.
Right.
And he looked around and saw what was and said what was so. He wasn't about to color things through a rosy color when they weren't that way.
Right.
And when we look at Detroit, if we look at it through the lens of this particular speech, many of the things that Dr. King talked about then exist today, and many of those things are worse now. Many of those conditions are worse now than they were 50 years ago.
But if you're hopeful, you become very disenchanted because you said, what has changed, right? Dr. King talks about the ghetto of misery, the ghetto of poverty, and the ghetto of race. That triumvirate itself defines for many people Black life today in 2018.
It does, but one of the things is if you look at it through as if you were looking at life through a pinhole. Because in 1967, there were far fewer people of African-American descent capable of moving to a Bloomfield Hills or moving to a Grosse Pointe or moving to a West Bloomfield. There were very few Americans who occupied relatively high positions in corporations. There were very few people who could live life like an Oprah Winfrey or LeBron James 50 years ago. So if you look at life that way, there are quite a number of African Americans who've been able to squeeze through that pinhole into the broader society, that land of milk and honey that Dr. King referred to. But there are far too many of us that are still left behind.
So in other words, there are to this day, in the words of Dr. King, the American Negro, that in fact there are few residents few Black residents in the America of opportunity.
There are relatively few compared to our overall numbers. And it's ironic that too many of us, even in the African-American community, look around and say, well, I made it out, I did it, and so you should be able to as well.
Stop complaining. It's all about